The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the empty kindergarten classroom as Miss Elena Rodriguez gathered the last of the construction paper scraps from the afternoon's art project. It was nearly 6 in the evening, well past the time when most teachers had gone home, but Elena had always been the type to stay late. She believed that a clean, organized classroom helped her students feel safe and ready to learn. As she wiped down the low tables where her 5-year-olds had enthusiastically glued cotton balls onto paper clouds, she heard something that made her pause. Music. Soft, delicate piano music was drifting through the hallway from somewhere in the building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena straightened up from the table and listened more carefully. Riverside Elementary School had an old upright piano in the multipurpose room at the end of the main corridor. The instrument had been donated years ago by a local church and was rarely used except during the annual winter concert when the music teacher would accompany the children singing seasonal songs. Most days, the piano sat silent and dusty in the corner of that large room, a relic from a time when the school district had more funding for arts programs. Elena had worked at Riverside for 7 years, and she could count on one hand the number of times she had heard anyone play that piano with any real skill. But this was different. This was not the halting, uncertain notes of a teacher picking out a melody for young children to follow. This was real music, fluid and confident, with a complexity that seemed impossible given the building's usual after-hours silence. Elena set down her cleaning supplies and walked toward her classroom door, her curiosity pulling her into the hallway. The music grew clearer as she stepped out into the corridor. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, something classical that she could not quite identify but that stirred something deep in her chest. Each note seemed perfectly placed, flowing into the next with a natural grace that suggested years of training and practice. Elena walked slowly down the hallway, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound on the polished linoleum floor. The school felt different in the evening hours. Without the chaos of children running and laughing, without the bells signaling transitions between activities, without the constant hum of young voices, the building took on an almost eerie quality. The walls were decorated with colorful student artwork and motivational posters, but in the dimming light, these cheerful decorations seemed to watch her pass with silent attention. As she approached the multipurpose room, the music became louder and more distinct. Elena could hear not just the melody now, but the subtle variations in volume and tempo that marked a truly skilled performance. Whoever was playing knew how to bring emotion out of that old piano, coaxing beauty from an instrument that most people dismissed as barely functional. Elena reached the doorway of the multipurpose room and stopped. She did not want to interrupt the performance, did not want to break the spell of the music with her presence. Instead, she stood just outside the door frame and carefully leaned forward to peek into the room. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Sitting at the piano bench, barely tall enough to reach the keys properly, was a small child. Even from her position in the doorway, Elena could see that the child was young, very young, possibly no more than 5 or 6 years old. The little pianist's legs dangled well above the floor, swinging slightly with the rhythm of the music. The child's hands moved across the keyboard with surprising confidence, the small fingers finding each key with precision and purpose. Elena stepped closer, moving quietly so as not to disturb the performance. As she entered the multipurpose room, she could see the child more clearly. The little pianist was wearing the kind of comfortable clothes that parents typically chose for school days, practical and easy to move in. The child's dark hair was slightly messy, as if they had been playing outside earlier and had not bothered to smooth it down. But it was the child's face that caught Elena's attention most. The expression was one of complete absorption, of total focus on the music being created. The child's eyes were fixed on the piano keys, watching the fingers move across the black and white surfaces with an intensity that seemed remarkable for someone so young. Elena recognized that level of focus. She had seen it before in her own classroom, in one particular student who had joined her kindergarten class at the beginning of the school year. The recognition sent a jolt through her system. She moved closer still, circling around to get a better view of the child's face. When she could finally see the profile clearly, Elena's suspicion was confirmed. The child playing the piano with such unexpected skill was Jacob Chen, one of her own students. Jacob was 5 years old and had been in Elena's kindergarten class for 3 months. He was a quiet child who rarely spoke and who seemed to exist in his own private world much of the time. During circle time, when the other children sat together and listened to stories, Jacob would often rock gently back and forth, his attention seemingly focused on something invisible that only he could perceive. During free play, while the other children formed groups and engaged in imaginative games together, Jacob preferred to line up blocks in precise rows or arrange toy cars by color and size. He did not play with the toys the way other children did. Instead, he organized them, created patterns with them, found order in them. Elena had worked with enough children over the years to recognize the signs. Early in the school year, she had gently suggested to Jacob's parents that they might want to have him evaluated by a specialist. The Chens had been receptive to the idea, and just last week, they had shared the diagnosis with Elena. Jacob was on the autism spectrum. The news had not surprised Elena, but it had given her a framework for understanding Jacob better, for recognizing that his brain worked differently than those of his neurotypical classmates, and that what might seem like difficult or withdrawn behavior was actually Jacob's way of processing and interacting with a world that often felt overwhelming to him. What Elena had never known, what she had never even suspected, was that Jacob could do this. She stood transfixed in the multipurpose room, watching her young student play the piano with a skill that seemed to defy everything she thought she knew about him. Jacob rarely participated in the music activities she incorporated into her classroom routine. When she led the class in simple songs, Jacob would sit silently, sometimes covering his ears if the singing grew too loud. When she brought out rhythm instruments for the children to explore, Jacob would touch them briefly but would not join in when the class played together. Yet here he was, alone in the empty school building, playing a complex classical piece as if he had been doing it for years. Elena watched Jacob's hands move across the keys. His fingers were small but moved with remarkable precision. She could see him reach for keys that seemed too far apart for his short arms, yet he managed to stretch and find each note exactly when it was needed. The music he was creating was not simple. This was not a basic melody that a beginner might learn. This was sophisticated, layered music with harmonies and rhythms that required real understanding and skill. Elena felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She was witnessing something extraordinary, something that made her question all her assumptions about what children could do, about what this particular child could do. Jacob, who struggled to make eye contact, who found verbal communication challenging, who became distressed by changes in routine, was expressing himself through music in a way that was both beautiful and profound. The piece Jacob was playing built toward a crescendo, the notes coming faster and more forcefully. Elena could see the concentration on his face intensify. His whole small body was engaged in the performance, leaning into the instrument, his shoulders moving slightly with the rhythm. Then, gradually, the music began to soften again. The notes became gentler, more sparse, like the last drops of rain after a storm. Jacob played the final notes with such delicacy that Elena had to strain to hear them. When the last note faded into silence, Jacob sat very still, his hands resting on the keys. Elena realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly, trying not to make any sound that might startle Jacob. For a long moment, the child simply sat at the piano, staring at the keys as if seeing them for the first time. Then, without any warning, Jacob began to play again. This time, the music was different. The melody was simpler, more repetitive, but no less beautiful. It had a quality that reminded Elena of a lullaby, something soothing and gentle that might help a frightened child feel safe. She wondered if this was a piece Jacob had heard somewhere and memorized, or if perhaps he was creating this music himself, pulling it from some deep place inside him that words could not reach. Elena knew she needed to let Jacob's parents know what she had just discovered. The Chens were good people who loved their son deeply, but they had been struggling to understand him, to find ways to connect with a child who seemed to live behind an invisible wall that kept the rest of the world at a distance. They had told Elena about their fears for Jacob's future, their worries about whether he would be able to form friendships, to learn effectively in a traditional school environment, to find happiness in a world that was not designed for the way his mind worked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If they knew that Jacob had this gift, this remarkable ability to create beauty through music, it might change everything for them. It might give them hope and a new way to reach their son. But Elena also knew she could not interrupt Jacob right now. This moment was his, and it was sacred. She could see that playing the piano was not just something Jacob could do well. It was something that brought him peace, that allowed him to exist fully in a way that the regular chaos of kindergarten never did. So Elena stood quietly in the multipurpose room, bearing witness to her student's extraordinary talent, and she let him play. She let the music fill the empty school building, transforming the ordinary space into something magical. She let Jacob be exactly who he was in this moment, a 5-year-old child with autism who could speak through piano keys in ways that words could never capture. Jacob played for another 10 minutes, moving through different pieces or perhaps different movements of the same piece. Elena could not be sure. Her knowledge of classical music was limited to what she had picked up through general education and the occasional concert. But she knew enough to recognize that what she was hearing was exceptional, that Jacob possessed a gift that many people spent lifetimes trying to develop. When Jacob finally stopped playing, he sat at the piano for a moment longer, then carefully climbed down from the bench. Elena expected him to notice her standing there in the room, but Jacob's gaze never lifted to search for other people. Instead, he walked toward the door with the same focused expression he wore when moving through the classroom, his attention turned inward. Elena stepped back into the shadows near the wall, not wanting to startle him. Jacob passed within a few feet of her without seeming to register her presence. She watched as he left the multipurpose room and began walking down the hallway toward the main entrance of the school. Elena followed at a distance, concerned about where Jacob might be going, whether he was safe, whether someone was waiting for him. As they reached the main entrance, Elena saw a woman standing just inside the doors. The woman was looking at her phone, her expression distracted and slightly worried. When she glanced up and saw Jacob approaching, her face transformed with relief. Margaret Chen rushed forward and knelt down to her son's level. Jacob did not make eye contact with his mother, but he allowed her to gently place her hands on his shoulders. Elena could see Margaret speaking to Jacob, though she could not hear the words from her position down the hallway. The interaction between mother and son had the quality of a familiar routine, Margaret checking to make sure Jacob was all right, Jacob tolerating the attention without engaging with it directly. Elena knew she should reveal herself, should tell Margaret what she had just witnessed, but something held her back. She needed time to process what she had seen, to think about the best way to share this information with Jacob's parents. Margaret took Jacob's hand, and together they walked out of the school building into the parking lot. Elena moved to the window and watched as Margaret helped Jacob into the back seat of their car, carefully fastening his seatbelt the way she probably did every day. Margaret then walked around to the driver's side and got in. The car pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the street. Elena stood at the window long after the car had gone, her mind racing with questions. How long had Jacob been able to play the piano like that? Had his parents heard him play? Did they have a piano at home? If they did not know about his ability, how had he learned to play so well? Where had he found the time to practice? The questions multiplied in her mind, but underneath them all was a profound sense of wonder. In her 7 years of teaching, Elena had encountered many children with various talents and abilities. She had taught children who were gifted artists, children who could solve math problems that seemed beyond their years, children who could memorize and recite lengthy passages after hearing them just once. But she had never encountered anything quite like this. Jacob's piano playing was not just impressive for a 5-year-old child. It was impressive by any standard. Elena finally turned away from the window and walked back down the hallway to her classroom. She needed to gather her things and go home, but her mind was not on the tasks at hand. She kept hearing the music Jacob had played, kept seeing his small hands moving across the piano keys with such confidence and grace. She thought about Jacob in her classroom, about the challenges he faced with activities that other children found easy, about how he struggled with transitions and became overwhelmed by loud noises and unexpected changes. She thought about how the other children sometimes tried to play with Jacob but would give up when he did not respond the way they expected. She thought about the parent-teacher conference she had had with the Chens just last week, where they had discussed Jacob's diagnosis and what it might mean for his education going forward. Margaret and David Chen had been so worried during that conference, so focused on what Jacob could not do, on the ways he struggled to meet typical developmental milestones. Elena had tried to reassure them that Jacob was making progress in his own way, that he was learning and growing even if it did not always look the way they expected. But now Elena realized she had been missing something crucial. She had been so focused on helping Jacob navigate the standard kindergarten curriculum that she had failed to discover this enormous talent he possessed. How many other gifts might children have that teachers never discovered because those gifts did not fit into the narrow boxes of traditional education? Elena sat down at her desk and pulled out a notepad. She began writing notes to herself about what she had observed, details about the music Jacob had played, the way he had looked while playing, the skill he had demonstrated. She wanted to capture as much as she could remember while it was still fresh in her mind. As she wrote, Elena began to form a plan. She needed to talk to Jacob's parents, but she wanted to do it carefully. She did not want to overwhelm them or make them feel like they had failed to notice something important about their son. She wanted to frame this discovery as the gift it was, as a window into Jacob's inner world that could help them understand and connect with him better. Elena also began thinking about how she might incorporate music more intentionally into her classroom in ways that might benefit not just Jacob but all her students. Perhaps there were other children who could express themselves through music in ways they could not through words. Perhaps music could be a bridge for children who struggled with traditional forms of communication. The possibilities began to unfold in her mind, each one building on the last. But underneath all the practical planning and the professional considerations was something more personal and profound. Elena felt privileged to have witnessed Jacob's performance. In that empty multipurpose room, with no audience to perform for and no expectations to meet, Jacob had been completely himself. He had shared something precious and true, and Elena had been there to receive it. She knew that this moment would stay with her for the rest of her teaching career, a reminder of why she had chosen this profession in the first place. Teaching was not just about conveying information or helping children master specific skills. It was about seeing each child clearly, about recognizing and nurturing the unique gifts that every child brought into the world, even when those gifts were hidden or unexpected. Elena finished her notes and gathered her belongings. As she locked her classroom door and walked through the now dark hallway toward the exit, she could still hear the echo of Jacob's music in her mind. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of sharing this discovery with Jacob's parents. Tomorrow, she would start thinking about how to support Jacob's musical development while still helping him navigate the challenges he faced. Tomorrow, there would be plans to make and conversations to have. But tonight, Elena simply held the memory of the music close, grateful to have witnessed something so beautiful and unexpected. She walked out into the parking lot, where her car sat alone under the orange glow of the streetlights. The evening air was cool and carried the scent of autumn leaves. As Elena drove home through the quiet streets, she found herself humming the melody Jacob had played, trying to capture and hold on to the beauty of what she had heard. She knew that she had been changed by what she had witnessed, that her understanding of her students and of teaching itself had been expanded in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The next morning, Elena arrived at school earlier than usual. She had spent much of the night thinking about how to approach the conversation with Jacob's parents, and she had decided that the direct approach was best. She would call them today and ask if they could come in for a brief meeting. She would not tell them what it was about over the phone. This was news that needed to be delivered in person, where she could see their faces and respond to their reactions. As her kindergarten students began arriving for the day, Elena watched Jacob carefully. He entered the classroom holding his mother's hand, his gaze focused on the floor as usual. Margaret helped him remove his backpack and hang it in his designated cubby, then knelt down to say goodbye. Jacob tolerated his mother's hug without returning it, his body remaining stiff and his attention elsewhere. This was typical for Jacob. Physical affection seemed to be difficult for him, something he endured rather than sought out. Margaret caught Elena's eye and gave a small wave before heading toward the door. Elena made a quick decision and hurried over to catch Margaret before she left. Margaret turned, a look of concern crossing her face. Teachers who chased parents down usually had bad news to share. Elena spoke quietly, mindful of the other parents and children in the classroom. She asked if Margaret and David might be able to come in for a meeting later in the week, emphasizing that it was not about any problem or concern. Margaret's expression shifted from worry to puzzlement. She agreed to check with David and find a time that would work for both of them. Elena thanked her and returned to greeting the other arriving students. Throughout the morning, Elena found her attention repeatedly drawn to Jacob. She watched as he moved through the classroom routine, noting details she might have overlooked before. During circle time, when the class sang their good morning song, Jacob sat with his hands over his ears, his eyes closed. Elena had always interpreted this as Jacob being overwhelmed by the noise and stimulation. Now she wondered if perhaps it was something else. Maybe the problem was not that Jacob was sensitive to music, but that the simple, repetitive children's songs they sang in class were not interesting enough to hold his attention. Maybe his musical ear was so sophisticated that the off-key singing of 5-year-olds was actually painful to him in a way it was not for other children. During center time, Elena set up a small keyboard in the music area of the classroom. It was a simple electronic keyboard with just 2 octaves, not a real piano by any measure, but she was curious to see if Jacob would gravitate toward it. She made a mental note of where Jacob was in the room and what he was doing, then turned her attention to other students who needed help with their chosen activities. 10 minutes later, Elena glanced toward the music area and saw that Jacob had moved there. He was standing in front of the keyboard, staring at it but not touching it. Elena approached slowly, not wanting to disrupt whatever was happening in Jacob's mind. She knelt down near him and spoke softly, telling him that he could play the keyboard if he wanted to, that it was there for all the children to explore. Jacob did not acknowledge her words or her presence, but after a moment, he reached out and pressed one key. The electronic sound was thin and artificial compared to the rich tones of the upright piano in the multipurpose room. Jacob pressed another key, then another. Elena watched as he slowly played a simple scale, his small finger moving methodically from one white key to the next. The other children in the music area had stopped what they were doing to watch Jacob. One girl, Emily, moved closer and asked Jacob if he knew how to play songs. Jacob did not respond to her question. He continued pressing keys in patterns that seemed random to Elena, though she suspected they might have an underlying logic that she could not perceive. Emily asked again, louder this time, but Jacob still did not respond. Elena gently redirected Emily to another activity, explaining that Jacob was concentrating on the keyboard and needed space to explore it in his own way. Over the next hour, Jacob remained at the keyboard. He did not play anything recognizable as a song, at least not to Elena's ears. Instead, he seemed to be experimenting with the sounds, pressing different combinations of keys and listening carefully to the results. His expression never changed from its usual focused neutrality, but Elena sensed that something important was happening. Jacob was engaging with the keyboard in a way he rarely engaged with other classroom materials. When it was time to transition to the next activity, Elena warned Jacob that center time would be ending in 5 minutes. Jacob did not acknowledge the warning, which was typical. When the 5 minutes had passed and Elena announced that it was time to clean up and move to the next activity, Jacob did not move away from the keyboard. This was also typical. Transitions were one of the most challenging parts of the day for Jacob. Elena approached him and knelt down to his level. She told him gently that it was time to put the keyboard away and join the other children for snack time. Jacob's hands pressed down harder on the keys, creating a discordant sound. His body became rigid, and Elena recognized the signs that Jacob was becoming distressed. She had learned to read these signals over the months she had known him. If she pushed too hard right now, Jacob might have a meltdown that would take a long time to recover from. Elena made a quick decision. She told Jacob that he could stay at the keyboard for 5 more minutes while the other children had their snack, but then he would need to put it away and join the group. She set a visual timer where Jacob could see it. Something she had learned helped him understand the passage of time better than verbal warnings. Then she moved away and began helping the other children with their snack routine. Elena kept an eye on Jacob while managing the rest of the class. He continued playing the keyboard, his fingers moving across the keys with increasing confidence. When the timer went off, Jacob stopped playing immediately. Elena was surprised. Usually, timers helped but did not completely solve the transition problem. Jacob carefully pushed the keyboard back against the wall where Elena stored it, then walked over to join the other children at the snack table. This level of cooperation was unusual for Jacob, and Elena found herself wondering if the keyboard had somehow helped him regulate himself, had given him what he needed to then participate in the group activity. The rest of the morning passed normally. Jacob engaged minimally with the other activities, as he typically did. During outdoor playtime, he spent most of the period organizing small rocks by size rather than running and playing with the other children. At lunchtime, he ate his food methodically, consuming each item completely before moving to the next, and keeping his attention fixed on his food rather than on the social interactions happening around him. But Elena found herself seeing all these behaviors through a new lens. Before yesterday, she had viewed Jacob primarily through the framework of his challenges, the things he struggled with and needed support to manage. Now she was beginning to understand that Jacob's way of being in the world was not just a collection of deficits. It was a different way of experiencing and processing reality, one that came with its own gifts and abilities. 2 days later, Elena sat in her classroom after school hours, waiting for Jacob's parents to arrive for the meeting she had requested. She had arranged the adult-sized chairs in a small circle in the reading area of the classroom, wanting the conversation to feel informal and comfortable rather than like an official disciplinary conference. She had her notes from the piano observation in front of her, along with some research she had done about musical ability in children with autism. Elena had discovered that many children on the autism spectrum showed exceptional abilities in specific areas, sometimes called savant skills, though that term was becoming less commonly used. Music was one area where these exceptional abilities sometimes emerged, possibly because music provided structure and pattern without requiring the complex social navigation that verbal communication demanded. Margaret and David Chen arrived exactly on time, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and mild anxiety. Elena greeted them warmly and invited them to sit down. She began by thanking them for coming and reassuring them once again that there was no problem. In fact, she said, she had something remarkable to share with them. Elena described what she had witnessed 2 evenings before. She told them about hearing the piano music and following the sound to the multipurpose room. She described Jacob's performance in as much detail as she could recall, trying to convey not just the technical skill but also the emotion and beauty of the music. As she spoke, she watched the Chen's faces carefully. Margaret and David listened with expressions of growing astonishment. When Elena finished her account, there was a long moment of silence. Then David spoke, his voice uncertain. He said they did not have a piano at home. Jacob had never shown any interest in music that they had noticed. They had no idea where he could have learned to play like Elena was describing. Margaret added that Jacob seemed bothered by music sometimes, that he would cover his ears when they played the radio in the car or when music was playing in stores. They had assumed he did not like music at all. Elena nodded, understanding their confusion. She suggested that perhaps Jacob's sensitivity to sound was actually a heightened awareness of music, that maybe what bothered him was not music itself but music that was too loud or too chaotic or somehow not right for his sensitive ears. She asked if there were any family members who played piano or if Jacob might have been exposed to piano music in some other setting. David and Margaret looked at each other, clearly searching their memories for any explanation. Finally, Margaret said that David's mother, Jacob's grandmother, had been a piano teacher before she passed away 2 years earlier. She had lived in Taiwan, and the Chens had visited her there several times before Jacob was born and once when he was just a baby. But Jacob could not possibly remember those visits. He had been too young. Elena listened thoughtfully, then asked if the grandmother might have had a piano in her home that Jacob could have been exposed to, even as an infant. David confirmed that yes, his mother had kept a grand piano in her living room. She had used it for teaching her students and for her own playing. Elena suggested gently that perhaps Jacob had formed some early memory or connection with that piano and with music in general during those visits. Maybe hearing his grandmother play had imprinted on him in some way that they had not recognized at the time. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She said that David's mother had loved music more than anything, that she had always said music was a universal language that could communicate things words could not. The fact that Jacob might have inherited or absorbed this love of music from his grandmother felt like a precious gift, a connection to a woman who had passed before Jacob was old enough to really know her. David reached over and took Margaret's hand. He asked Elena what they should do with this information. Should they get Jacob a piano? Should they find him a teacher? He admitted that they had very limited financial resources, that raising a child with special needs came with many additional expenses they had not anticipated, and they were not sure they could afford piano lessons or an instrument. Elena assured them that they did not need to make any big decisions right away. She suggested that they first try to arrange for Jacob to have regular access to a piano to see if his interest and ability continued. She said she would speak with the school principal about allowing Jacob to use the piano in the multipurpose room during lunch or before school. She also said she would reach out to her network of teacher friends to see if anyone knew of a piano teacher who might be willing to work with Jacob at a reduced cost or even as a volunteer, given his exceptional circumstances. Margaret wiped her eyes and thanked Elena, her voice thick with emotion. She said they had been so focused on Jacob's challenges, on all the ways he struggled, that it had become hard to see beyond those difficulties. Learning that he had this remarkable gift changed something for them. It gave them hope that Jacob's future might hold possibilities they had not imagined. David added that they had been worried about Jacob's ability to connect with other people, to find his place in a world that did not always understand or accommodate people who were different. But maybe music could be that connection. Maybe music could be how Jacob communicated with others and found his community. Elena felt her own emotions rising as she listened to the Chens process this information. This was why she had become a teacher. These moments when a child's life opened up in new directions, when parents discovered reasons for hope they had not known existed, when the future suddenly seemed brighter and fuller of potential. The three adults sat together in the small kindergarten classroom, surrounded by colorful posters and children's artwork, and talked about Jacob and music and possibility. Elena shared more observations from the past few days, describing how Jacob had interacted with the small keyboard she had introduced in the classroom. The Chens shared stories about Jacob's other behaviors at home that they were now beginning to see in a new light. Margaret mentioned that Jacob sometimes hummed to himself, always the same melody, and they had wondered if it was a form of self-stimulation. Now they wondered if perhaps he was composing or practicing music in his own mind. David recalled that Jacob seemed to have perfect pitch, though they had never thought of it in those terms before. If someone sang a note, even slightly off-key, Jacob would become visibly distressed. They had thought it was just another example of his sensitivity to sounds, but maybe it was actually an indication of sophisticated musical hearing. The conversation stretched on for nearly an hour. When the Chens finally stood to leave, they looked different than when they had arrived. They stood a little taller. Their expressions held less worry and more wonder. They thanked Elena repeatedly for paying attention to Jacob, for taking the time to follow the sound of music and discover something they had missed. As Elena walked them to the classroom door, Margaret turned back with one more question. She asked if Elena thought Jacob understood how special his ability was, if he knew that what he could do was remarkable. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. She said that Jacob probably did not think about his piano playing in those terms. For Jacob, playing piano was not about being special or remarkable. It was simply about expressing something inside himself that had no other outlet. The music was not performance. It was communication. It was Jacob's truest voice. Margaret nodded slowly, seeming to understand. She and David said their goodbyes and left. Elena stood in her empty classroom, feeling the weight and the gift of what she had witnessed and shared. She had been a teacher long enough to know that moments like this were rare. Most days were filled with small victories and minor struggles, with the ordinary work of helping young children learn basic skills and navigate social interactions. But every once in a while, something extraordinary happened. A child revealed something unexpected. A family found new hope. A teacher glimpsed the profound mystery of human potential and diversity. Elena walked over to the reading area and began straightening the adult chairs she had arranged for the meeting. As she worked, she thought about Jacob and about all the students she had taught over the years. She thought about how easy it was to make assumptions about children based on surface observations, to see their challenges more clearly than their gifts, to focus on helping them fit into predetermined molds rather than discovering who they truly were and helping them become more fully themselves. She resolved to carry the lesson of Jacob's piano playing with her going forward, to remember that every child contained multitudes, that gifts and abilities could be hidden behind behaviors that seemed like nothing more than struggles or difficulties, that her job as a teacher was not just to instruct but to discover, to see, to bear witness to the unique miracle of each young person in her care. That evening, Elena went home and searched online for information about musical prodigies, about autism and musical ability, about ways to support exceptional talents in young children. She read articles written by specialists and watched videos of other children who had shown remarkable musical abilities at young ages. She learned that what she had witnessed with Jacob, while rare, was not completely unknown. There were documented cases of children on the autism spectrum who demonstrated extraordinary musical memory and ability, who could play complex pieces after hearing them just once, who seemed to process and understand music at a level far beyond their years. Elena also learned about the challenges these children faced, about the difficulty of finding appropriate education and support, about the way extraordinary abilities in one area did not necessarily translate to greater ease in other areas of life. Jacob would still struggle with many aspects of daily living. His musical gift did not erase his autism or make the world less overwhelming for him. But it did give him a voice and a way to connect with others that might otherwise have remained out of reach. Over the following weeks, Elena worked with the school administration to arrange regular piano time for Jacob. The principal, a pragmatic woman named Dr. Sanchez, was initially skeptical. She worried about setting precedents and about giving special treatment to one student that might be difficult to extend to others. But when Elena explained the situation and described what she had witnessed, Dr. Sanchez agreed to visit Jacob during one of his piano sessions to assess the situation for herself. Elena arranged for Jacob to use the multipurpose room during lunch recess 3 times a week. She worked with Margaret to adjust Jacob's schedule so that he could arrive at school 30 minutes early on those days. The first few sessions were tentative. Jacob seemed uncertain about this new routine, unsure whether he was truly allowed to play the piano during school hours. But gradually, he began to relax into the new schedule. Elena made a point of being present during these piano sessions, not to supervise Jacob but to witness his playing and to document his progress. She took videos on her phone, with Margaret's permission, so that she could study his technique and show others who might be able to help. She also brought Dr. Sanchez to observe during one session. The principal stood quietly in the doorway of the multipurpose room, listening as Jacob played. Elena watched Dr. Sanchez's face transform from skepticism to amazement. When Jacob finished the piece he was playing, Dr. Sanchez approached Elena with a stunned expression. She said that she had not believed that a 5-year-old child could play like that. She had thought perhaps Elena was exaggerating or seeing talent where there was only potential. But this was undeniable. Jacob was extraordinarily gifted. Dr. Sanchez became an advocate for Jacob from that moment forward. She reached out to her own contacts in the education community, looking for resources and expertise. She connected Elena with a retired music professor who had taught at the local university and who agreed to come observe Jacob and provide guidance. Professor Linda Morrison arrived at Riverside Elementary School on a Thursday morning in late November. She was in her 70s, with white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Elena met her at the front office and walked her to the multipurpose room, where Jacob was already at the piano for his morning session. Professor Morrison asked Elena to wait outside while she observed Jacob alone. She said that sometimes additional people in the room could be distracting, and she wanted to assess Jacob's playing without any variables that might affect his performance. Elena agreed, though she felt anxious about leaving Jacob alone with a stranger. She knew that Jacob did not do well with unexpected changes or unfamiliar people. But she also trusted Professor Morrison's expertise and experience. Elena waited in the hallway outside the multipurpose room. She could hear the piano music, could hear Jacob playing with the same confidence and skill she had witnessed that first evening. The session lasted about 30 minutes. When Professor Morrison emerged from the room, her expression was serious and thoughtful. She asked if they could sit down somewhere private to talk. Elena led her to a small conference room near the office. Once they were seated, Professor Morrison finally spoke, her voice measured and careful. She told Elena that in her 40 years of teaching music at the university level, she had encountered perhaps 3 or 4 students with the kind of natural ability that Jacob possessed. She said that what made Jacob's case even more remarkable was his age and the fact that he appeared to have had no formal instruction. The pieces he had played were not simple children's songs. They were intermediate to advanced classical compositions that typically required years of study to master. Elena asked how Jacob could possibly play such difficult music without lessons. Professor Morrison explained that there were rare cases of individuals with what researchers called heightened musical perception. These individuals seemed to process music differently than most people. They could hear a piece of music and understand not just the melody but the underlying structure, the harmonies, the patterns that created the emotional impact. For these individuals, learning to play an instrument was less about memorizing finger positions and more about translating what they already understood internally into physical action. The professor said that Jacob's autism might actually enhance this ability in some ways. Many individuals on the autism spectrum showed exceptional pattern recognition and memory. Music was essentially organized sound patterns, and someone with Jacob's neurological profile might be able to perceive and reproduce those patterns with unusual accuracy. Professor Morrison also noted that Jacob's playing showed remarkable emotional depth. He was not simply reproducing notes mechanically. He was playing with feeling and interpretation. This suggested that music was a form of emotional expression for Jacob, a way to communicate feelings that he might struggle to express through words or typical social interaction. Elena asked what should be done to support Jacob's development. Should his parents find him a traditional piano teacher? Should he be enrolled in some kind of special program? Professor Morrison considered the question carefully. She said that traditional piano instruction might actually be counterproductive for Jacob. Standard teaching methods relied heavily on verbal instruction and social interaction, following directions from a teacher, practicing specific exercises in a prescribed order. Given what Elena had described about Jacob's autism, those teaching methods might be frustrating or overwhelming for him. Instead, Professor Morrison suggested a different approach. Jacob should have regular access to a quality piano. He should be allowed to explore and play freely without pressure to perform or demonstrate progress in conventional ways. He should be exposed to a wide variety of classical music so that his musical vocabulary could continue expanding. And if possible, he should occasionally be observed by someone with musical expertise who could identify if he was developing any technical habits that might limit him later. Professor Morrison offered to serve in that observational role herself. She said she was retired and had time available. More than that, she was fascinated by Jacob's ability and wanted to witness his development. She asked if she might be allowed to visit once a month to listen to Jacob play and provide guidance to Elena and his parents about how to support him. Elena felt grateful, tears forming. She thanked Professor Morrison repeatedly. The professor smiled and said that discovering genuine musical genius was rare and precious. Being able to help nurture that genius was a privilege she was happy to accept. Over the following months, a routine developed around supporting Jacob's musical gift. He continued his 3 weekly piano sessions during school hours. Professor Morrison visited monthly, sitting quietly in the multipurpose room while Jacob played, taking notes about his technique and repertoire. After each visit, she met with Elena and the Chens to share observations and suggestions. Margaret and David had decided to redirect some of their limited resources towards supporting Jacob's music. They could not afford a piano for their home, but they found a small electronic keyboard at a thrift store for $20. The keyboard had weighted keys that provided some resistance, making it slightly more similar to a real piano than a cheap toy keyboard would be. They set up the keyboard in Jacob's bedroom, and Margaret reported that Jacob would sometimes play it in the evenings before bed. She said the music seemed to calm him, to help him transition from the stimulation of the day to the quiet of sleep. The Chens also began playing classical music in their home, using streaming services to access recordings of piano compositions. They noticed that Jacob would stop whatever he was doing when certain pieces played. He would stand very still, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening with his entire body. Then, the next time he had access to a piano, he would play portions of the pieces he had heard. His ability to reproduce music after hearing it seemed to be improving. Where initially he might capture the main melody of a piece, now he was reproducing harmonies and subtle variations. Professor Morrison confirmed that Jacob had what musicians called perfect pitch and exceptional auditory memory. He could identify any note played and remember complex musical passages after a single listening. These abilities, combined with his natural technical facility, meant that Jacob was essentially teaching himself advanced piano repertoire through listening and experimentation. In January, for months after Elena had first discovered Jacob playing piano, Professor Morrison brought a suggestion to the monthly meeting with Elena and the Chens. She said that Jacob's ability had progressed to a point where keeping it hidden seemed almost wrong. She proposed that Jacob give a small performance, nothing overwhelming or pressure-filled, but an opportunity for others to hear what he could do. She suggested that the performance could take place at the school, perhaps during an assembly or a parent event. The music could serve multiple purposes. It would allow Jacob's gift to be celebrated and acknowledged. It would help raise awareness about the diverse abilities that children with autism could possess. And practically, it might help attract resources and support for Jacob's continued development. Margaret and David looked uncertain. They worried about putting Jacob in a situation that might be stressful or overwhelming for him. Jacob did not like being the center of attention. He became anxious in crowds. How would he handle performing in front of an audience? Professor Morrison acknowledged these concerns. She said that they would need to prepare Jacob carefully. The performance should be in a familiar location, the multipurpose room where he already played regularly. The audience should be relatively small and composed primarily of people Jacob saw regularly, teachers, school staff, perhaps some parents from his class. There should be no pressure on Jacob to interact with the audience before or after playing. He would simply play the piano as he normally did, and then he would be allowed to leave. Elena added that they could frame the performance to Jacob not as a show but as an opportunity to share his music with people who wanted to hear it. They could keep everything as routine and predictable as possible, minimizing the elements that might cause him stress. The Chens discussed it quietly between themselves. Finally, David said that they wanted to try. They believed that Jacob's music was a gift that should be shared. If they could create conditions where Jacob felt safe and comfortable, then allowing others to hear him play seemed like the right thing to do. Over the next 6 weeks, preparations were made for Jacob's performance. Principal Sanchez designated a Friday afternoon in March for a small school assembly. She decided to frame it as a celebration of diverse talents and abilities, with Jacob's performance as the centerpiece. Elena worked with Margaret to prepare Jacob for the change in routine. They created a social story, a tool often used with autistic children to help them understand what would happen in an upcoming situation. The social story included simple drawings and text explaining that Jacob would play the piano in the multipurpose room and that there would be people sitting and listening. The story emphasized that Jacob would do exactly what he normally did during his piano time. The only difference would be that people would be there to hear the music. They read the social story to Jacob every day for 2 weeks before the performance. They also took him to the multipurpose room and showed him where chairs would be set up for the audience. They let him see that the piano would be in the same place it always was. They tried to make everything as predictable as possible. The day of the performance arrived. Elena felt nervous, though she tried not to show it. She worried that despite all their preparations, the change in routine might be too much for Jacob. He might refuse to play. He might become overwhelmed and have a meltdown. Or he might play but without the emotional depth and skill he showed during his private practice sessions. The assembly was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. The audience would consist of all the kindergarten and first grade classes, the school staff, and any parents who wished to attend. Margaret and David had both taken time off work to be there. Professor Morrison would be attending as well. At 1:30, Elena went to get Jacob from the classroom where he had spent the morning following his regular routine. She knelt down beside him and quietly reminded him that today was the day he would share his music with people. Jacob did not respond, but he stood up and took Elena's hand, which was more physical contact than he usually initiated. They walked together through the hallway toward the multipurpose room. As they got closer, Elena could hear the sound of people gathering, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of conversation. She felt Jacob's hand tighten around hers. She squeezed back gently and kept walking, maintaining a calm and steady presence. They entered the multipurpose room through a side door that led directly to the area where the piano was positioned. This had been part of the plan, to allow Jacob to approach the piano without having to walk through the audience. The multipurpose room was full. Every chair was occupied, and some people stood along the walls. Elena saw Margaret and David sitting in the front row, their faces tight with anxiety and hope. Professor Morrison sat near them, her expression calm and encouraging. Elena walked Jacob to the piano bench. He released her hand and climbed onto the bench with the same careful movements he used during his regular practice sessions. Elena stepped back, giving him space. The room gradually fell silent as people realized the performance was about to begin. Jacob sat at the piano, his small hands resting on his lap. He looked at the keys but did not immediately begin playing. Seconds passed. Then a minute. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable. Elena could see parents shifting in their seats. She could hear whispers starting. People were wondering if the child was going to play at all. Elena resisted the urge to intervene. She had learned that Jacob needed time to prepare himself mentally before beginning. Rushing him would only make things worse. She stood quietly, waiting and trusting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, Jacob placed his hands on the piano keys. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant. Elena recognized the piece. It was a Chopin nocturne, one of the recordings that Margaret had been playing at home. The melody was melancholy and beautiful, the kind of music that made people stop and listen without realizing they had done so. As Jacob continued playing, his confidence seemed to grow. His touch on the keys became more assured. The music flowed out of the piano, filling the multipurpose room with sound that was far more sophisticated than anyone had expected from a 5-year-old child. Elena watched the audience. Parents who had been skeptical or merely curious were now leaning forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from doubt to wonder. Teachers who had worked with Jacob and knew his challenges in the classroom looked stunned by the contrast between the boy who struggled with circle time and the young musician creating such beauty. The young students in the audience were remarkably quiet. Children that age often struggled to sit still for extended periods, but Jacob's music seemed to hold their attention in a way that was almost magical. Some of the children sat with their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide. Others swayed gently with the rhythm of the music. Margaret and David sat holding hands, tears streaming down both their faces. Elena could see the complex emotions they were experiencing. Pride in their son's extraordinary ability. Relief that he was handling the performance without becoming overwhelmed. Grief for all the struggles Jacob faced and would continue to face. And underneath everything, profound love for this complex, challenging, brilliant child. Jacob played for 15 minutes, moving through the Chopin Nocturne and into another piece that Elena did not recognize. His small figure at the large piano should have looked incongruous, a child playing at something beyond his capacity. But instead, there was something perfectly right about the scene. Jacob belonged at the piano in a way he did not quite belong anywhere else. When Jacob played the final notes and lifted his hands from the keys, the silence lasted for a heartbeat. Then the applause began. It started with a few people and quickly grew until everyone in the room was clapping. Some people stood. The applause was not just polite recognition. It was genuine amazement and appreciation. Jacob did not acknowledge the applause. He climbed down from the piano bench and looked around for Elena. She immediately moved to his side. She had promised him that after he finished playing, she would take him back to the classroom where he could have some quiet time alone. She intended to keep that promise. Elena took Jacob's hand and led him toward the side exit. As they walked, people continued applauding. Some called out congratulations or praise. Jacob gave no indication that he heard or understood any of it. His focus was entirely on leaving the room and returning to familiar, quiet space. Back in the classroom, Elena set Jacob up in the calm corner, a space she had created specifically for students who needed to decompress from overwhelming situations. She gave him his favorite sensory toy, a small ball filled with gel that could be squeezed and manipulated. Jacob took the toy and immediately began the repetitive squeezing motion that helped him self-regulate. Elena told him he had done a wonderful job and that she was proud of him. Jacob did not respond, but she had not expected him to. She knew that he needed time to recover from the stress of the performance, even though it had gone well. Elena left Jacob in the calm corner and returned to the multipurpose room to help manage the crowd. When she arrived, people were gathering around Margaret, David, and Professor Morrison, asking questions and offering praise and support. Principal Sanchez was explaining to a group of parents that the school was committed to supporting Jacob's development while also ensuring that his special needs were met. Several parents approached Elena directly. They thanked her for recognizing Jacob's talent and for creating opportunities for him to share it. One mother said that watching Jacob perform had changed her understanding of what children with autism could achieve. Another parent asked if Elena had other students with hidden talents that just needed to be discovered. Elena thought about that question later, after the crowd had dispersed and she was alone in her classroom preparing for the next school day. Did she have other students with remarkable abilities that she had not yet recognized? How many children move through the education system without anyone discovering what made them special and extraordinary? The question humbled her and renewed her commitment to really seeing each of her students, to looking beyond surface behaviors and conventional expectations to the unique human being underneath. The weeks following Jacob's performance brought unexpected developments. A local news station heard about the story and reached out to the school asking to do a feature about Jacob. Margaret and David were initially reluctant to expose Jacob to that level of public attention, but Professor Morrison encouraged them to consider it. She pointed out that visibility could lead to resources and opportunities that might otherwise be unavailable. After much discussion, the Chens agreed to a carefully controlled interview. The reporter could film Jacob playing piano but could not interact with him directly. Margaret and David would answer questions about Jacob's autism and his musical ability. Elena and Professor Morrison would provide educational context. The news segment aired on a Thursday evening in April. It was a 5-minute feature during the local news broadcast. The footage of Jacob playing piano was interspersed with interviews and explanations about autism spectrum disorder and musical savant abilities. The reporter handled the story with sensitivity, focusing on Jacob's gift while also acknowledging the challenges he faced. The response to the news segment was overwhelming. The television station received hundreds of emails and phone calls. Many were from parents of children with autism who felt encouraged by seeing Jacob's story. Others were from musicians and music educators who wanted to help support Jacob's development. Several people offered to donate money to help the Chens purchase a real piano for their home. One retired piano teacher reached out offering free lessons, though Professor Morrison gently explained that traditional lessons were not the best approach for Jacob. A local music store offered to loan the family a quality upright piano until they could afford to purchase one themselves. Most significantly, the news segment caught the attention of Dr. Raymond Foster, the director of a prestigious music academy located about an hour from Riverside. Dr. Foster contacted Professor Morrison, who he had known professionally for many years. He said that he had watched the news feature about Jacob and was intrigued by the boy's ability. He wanted to know if Jacob might be a candidate for the Academy's Young Scholars program. Professor Morrison was surprised by the inquiry. The Young Scholars program at Foster Academy was highly selective. It provided intensive musical training to exceptionally gifted children, typically starting around age 7 or 8. The program had produced several musicians who had gone on to successful professional careers. Students in the program received daily instruction from master teachers, had access to world-class instruments and facilities, and were exposed to visiting musicians and composers from around the world. The program was also expensive. Tuition ran to tens of thousands of dollars per year, far beyond what the Chens could afford. Professor Morrison explained this to Dr. Foster, but he said that the Academy had scholarship funds for truly exceptional students. If Jacob was as talented as he appeared in the news footage, financial barriers would not prevent him from participating. However, Dr. Foster wanted to assess Jacob in person before making any commitments. He proposed visiting Riverside Elementary to hear Jacob play and to evaluate whether the program would be appropriate given Jacob's age and autism diagnosis. Professor Morrison brought this opportunity to Elena and the Chens. The adults gathered in Elena's classroom after school to discuss what it might mean. Margaret expressed concerns about Jacob attending a specialized program. She worried that it would be too demanding, too far from home, too different from the routine Jacob had finally grown comfortable with. David was more intrigued by the possibility. He said that if Jacob had extraordinary talent, did they not have a responsibility to help him develop it fully? What if Jacob could become a professional musician, could build a life around the one thing he truly excelled at? Would they forgive themselves if they passed up an opportunity that might change his future? Elena listened to both perspectives and understood the difficulty of the decision. She shared her own observations about Jacob's relationship with music. She said that playing piano seemed to be more than just a skill for Jacob. It appeared to be essential to his emotional well-being, a way for him to process and express things that his autism made difficult to handle in other ways. The question was not just whether Jacob could benefit from advanced training, but whether such training would enhance or diminish the joy and comfort he found in music. Professor Morrison added her thoughts. She said that she had seen many talented young musicians over her career. Some had thrived with intensive training and high expectations. Others had been damaged by too much pressure too early, losing their love of music when it became work rather than play. With Jacob, the situation was even more delicate because his autism meant that he experienced stress and pressure differently than neurotypical children. What might seem like exciting opportunity to some could feel like unbearable overwhelm to Jacob. The group decided that the first step was to arrange Dr. Foster's visit and assessment. They could learn more about what the program would actually involve before making any decisions. Dr. Foster arrived at Riverside Elementary on a sunny morning in May. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. Professor Morrison greeted him warmly, and Elena welcomed him to the school. The plan was for Dr. Foster to observe Jacob during one of his regular piano sessions, much as Professor Morrison had done months earlier. Jacob had been prepared for a visitor through his social story routine. Elena had explained that a man who knew a lot about music would be listening when Jacob played piano today. She had shown Jacob a photo of Dr. Foster so the stranger's face would be somewhat familiar. When the time came, Elena walked Jacob to the multipurpose room as usual. Dr. Foster was already there, sitting in a chair positioned away from the piano, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. Jacob glanced at the visitor briefly but showed no particular reaction. He climbed onto the piano bench and sat for his usual minute of preparation. Then he began to play. Elena and Professor Morrison waited outside the multipurpose room with Margaret and David, who had come to the school for this important assessment. They could hear the piano music flowing through the closed door. Margaret twisted her hands together nervously. David stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Professor Morrison placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. The session lasted 45 minutes, longer than Jacob's usual practice time. When Dr. Foster finally emerged from the multipurpose room, his expression was serious and thoughtful. Jacob came out a moment later and went directly to Elena, ready to return to his classroom routine. Elena took Jacob back to class, leaving the other adults to speak with Dr. Foster. When she returned to the multipurpose room 15 minutes later, she found them all sitting in a small circle, engaged in intense conversation. Dr. Foster looked up as Elena entered and gestured for her to join them. He said that he needed to be completely honest about what he had observed. Jacob's technical ability was remarkable for his age and lack of formal training. His musical memory and perfect pitch were exceptional. His ability to interpret and express emotion through music was unusually sophisticated. However, Dr. Foster had also observed concerning elements. Jacob's posture and hand position, while functional, were not optimal and could lead to problems if he continued playing at an advanced level without correction. Some of his fingering choices worked for now but would limit him as pieces became more technically demanding. These issues were correctable, but they would require the kind of detailed technical instruction that might be difficult given Jacob's autism and his learning style. More significantly, Dr. Foster had concerns about whether Jacob would be able to handle the structure and social demands of the Young Scholars program. The program required students to participate in group classes, to work with multiple teachers, to perform regularly in recitals and competitions. Students needed to accept correction and instruction, to practice specific exercises even when they were not inherently interesting, to collaborate with other young musicians. Based on what Dr. Foster had been told about Jacob's autism, many of these requirements might be extremely challenging or even impossible for him. Dr. Foster said that he was not categorically rejecting Jacob's participation in the program. But he wanted everyone to think carefully about whether it was truly in Jacob's best interest. Musical talent alone was not enough to justify placing a child in an environment that might be overwhelming or damaging to their well-being. The adults sat in silence for a moment, processing this assessment. Finally, Margaret spoke. She thanked Dr. Foster for his honesty. She said that she and David had been worried about the same things. Jacob had finally found some stability and peace in his daily routine. Disrupting that for the sake of advanced musical training seemed like it might do more harm than good, even if the training would improve his technical abilities. David nodded agreement. He said that after thinking about it more deeply, he realized that his enthusiasm for the academy program had been partly about his own hopes and dreams rather than what Jacob actually needed. He wanted Jacob to have opportunities and success. But maybe success for Jacob looked different than it did for neurotypical children. Maybe success was finding joy and expression through music without the pressure of performance and professional development. Professor Morrison spoke up. She said that there might be a middle path. Perhaps instead of enrolling in the full Young Scholars program, Jacob could work with one of the academy teachers on an individual basis. The instruction could be tailored to his specific needs and learning style. It could happen at times and in places where Jacob felt comfortable. There would be no pressure to perform or compete, just careful guidance to help Jacob develop technically without losing the joy he found in music. Dr. Foster considered this proposal. He said it was possible. He knew several teachers at the academy who had experience working with students with special needs. He could make inquiries about whether someone might be willing to take Jacob on as a private student, possibly at a reduced rate given the unusual circumstances. This suggestion felt right to everyone. It provided a way to support Jacob's development without pushing him into situations that might be harmful. Over the next several weeks, arrangements were made. Professor Morrison and Dr. Foster identified a piano teacher named Sarah Kim who had both excellent musical credentials and experience working with autistic students. Sarah agreed to meet with Jacob and his family to assess whether she would be a good fit. The meeting took place at the Chen family's home on a Saturday afternoon in June. Sarah was in her 30s, with a warm manner and genuine enthusiasm for teaching. She had brought information about her teaching approach and some materials she thought might be useful for working with Jacob. Sarah explained that her philosophy was to meet each student where they were and to adapt her teaching to their needs rather than forcing them into a predetermined mold. With Jacob, she would focus on helping him develop the technical foundation he needed while respecting his unique way of learning and processing information. She would use visual aids and demonstrations rather than lengthy verbal explanations. She would allow Jacob to have input into what pieces he worked on. And she would always prioritize keeping music joyful and meaningful rather than turning it into obligation or drudgery. After they talked for a while, Sarah asked if she might hear Jacob play. Margaret led them all to Jacob's small bedroom where the lone upright piano now stood against one wall. The piano had arrived 2 weeks earlier, a donation facilitated by Dr. Foster's contacts in the music community. It was a beautiful instrument, old but well maintained, with a rich tone that filled the small room. Jacob had been playing it constantly since it arrived. Margaret said he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and play quietly for an hour before returning to bed. Jacob was already sitting at the piano when the adults entered the room, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Without any preamble or acknowledgement of the visitors, he began to play. Sarah listened intently, her trained ear catching details that the others might miss. She watched Jacob's hands, his posture, the way he moved with the music. When Jacob finished the piece and sat quietly with his hands in his lap, Sarah smiled. She turned to Margaret and David and said that she would be honored to work with Jacob. She saw tremendous potential in him, and she believed she could help him develop technically while respecting who he was and how he learned. Over the summer months, Sarah began working with Jacob once a week. The lessons took place in Jacob's home, in the familiar environment where he felt safe. Sarah quickly learned that traditional teaching methods did not work with Jacob. He could not follow complex verbal instructions. He became frustrated when asked to repeat specific exercises that he found boring. He refused to use method books or practice scales in conventional ways. But Sarah was patient and creative. She found ways to teach technical skills through pieces that Jacob already wanted to play. She made videos demonstrating proper hand position and fingering that Jacob could watch repeatedly. She used colored stickers on the piano keys to help Jacob visualize patterns and positions. Most importantly, she learned to read Jacob's nonverbal communication, to recognize when he was engaged and when he was becoming overwhelmed, to push him gently toward improvement without demanding things he could not give. By the end of summer, Jacob's playing had noticeably improved. His hand position was better. His fingering was more efficient. His understanding of musical structure had deepened. But more than the technical improvements, Jacob seemed happier. Having the piano in his home, having regular time to play without restriction, having a teacher who understood and accepted him, all of this contributed to Jacob's well-being in ways that extended beyond music. When September arrived and Jacob began first grade, Elena was no longer his teacher. He had moved up to the next level, and a new teacher named Mr. Garcia was responsible for his daily education. But Elena stayed connected to Jacob and his family. She checked in regularly with Margaret to hear about Jacob's progress. She attended his occasional informal performances at the school. And she remained grateful for the lesson Jacob had taught her about seeing beyond surface appearances, about recognizing that every child contained depths and gifts that might not be immediately visible. Years later, Elena would think back on that evening when she had heard piano music in the empty school building and followed the sound to discover Jacob at the piano. That single moment of curiosity and attention had changed Jacob's life trajectory and had changed Elena's understanding of teaching. She had learned that her job was not just to instruct children in predetermined skills but to notice them fully, to discover who they truly were beneath their behaviors and challenges, to help them find their own unique ways of being in the world. Jacob continued to develop musically throughout his childhood. By age 10, he was playing at a level that matched many adult amateur pianists. By 12, he was performing in community concerts and regional competitions. His autism remained a significant part of his life, creating ongoing challenges in social situations and conventional academic settings. But music gave him a voice, a way to connect with others, a source of joy and meaning that sustained him through difficult times. And it all began because one kindergarten teacher stayed late after school, heard unexpected music, and decided to investigate rather than ignore it. That simple act of paying attention had revealed a gift that might otherwise have remained hidden, had changed the trajectory of a young boy's life, had brought hope to a family, and had reminded everyone involved that human beings were endlessly surprising, endlessly capable of beauty and excellence, regardless of how different or challenging they might appear on the surface. 10 years passed. Jacob stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for his cue. At 15, he would become the youngest pianist to perform a full solo recital at the prestigious venue. Margaret and David sat in the audience, holding hands tightly. Beside them sat Elena, now a principal herself, and Professor Morrison, frail but determined to witness this moment. Sarah Kim stood in the wings, beaming with pride at her extraordinary student. As Jacob walked onto the stage and sat at the grand piano, the audience fell silent. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The music that filled the hall was breathtaking, technically flawless, and emotionally profound. Jacob still rarely spoke. He still struggled with eye contact in social situations. But through music, he communicated everything that mattered. When the final notes faded and the audience erupted in applause, Jacob stood and bowed awkwardly, then quickly left the stage. He found Elena waiting in the hallway. Without words, he briefly touched her hand in gratitude. That single evening years ago, when she had followed unexpected music down an empty hallway, had changed everything. Sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, waiting only for someone willing to truly see. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.